Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you again. This is part 2 of our discussion on race, and this discussion is going to focus more on race in journalism. And with me is a very special guest. I'm very honored to have you.
Thank you.
Monica Richardson, who is the editor and executive editor of the Miami Herald. And I wonder if you could just introduce yourself to our members here and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you all for having me today. I have been at the Miami Herald and I'm also the executive editor of the El Nuevo Herald, a Spanish language product. And I'm McClatchy's Florida regional editor, which includes the Bradenton Herald as well as the Florida Keys Now website. So I've been there for less than a year. And I took on the role after coming here from Atlanta. I was at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for 15 years and left there as the senior managing editor. My career has taken me through Jacksonville, Lexington. I'm born and raised in the DC, Virginia area, in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so I kind of started the path of newspapers as a small town reporter and worked my way up. And at my core, I'm a journalist without a title, basically. I got the big title, but at my core, I'm a journalist. So excited to be here to, this is an important conversation, obviously. It's one that I've had probably 4 or 5 times easily in this kind of setting since I started this role. And it's important one, so thank you for having me.
Thank you, thank you. So before I ask you the first question, I kind of have a preamble, so just bear with me. Okay, and this is just to kind of put your appointment in perspective. An American Society of News Editors survey in 2018 found that only 7.19% of full-time newsroom employees were Black, and only about 20% of those Black employees were in leadership roles. But beginning last year, there was a major attempt to address the lack of representation in newsrooms across the country. Newsrooms across the country hired women and people of color in very large numbers. And just a couple of examples: the Washington Post appointed Sally Busby, a white woman, executive editor. Los Angeles Times appointed Kevin Merida, a Black man, executive editor. The Texas Tribune appointed Sewell Chan, an Asian American man, and the list goes on. And the following Black women have been appointed to helm their news organizations: Kim Godwin of ABC News, Rashida Jones of MSNBC, Patricia Mays, Hollywood Reporter, Maria Reeve, Houston Chronicle, Catrice Hardy, Dallas Morning News, and Monica Richardson, the Miami Herald. So this is what Catrice Hardy of the Dallas Morning News said about her appointment and the appointment of other Black women last year. She said, it's unprecedented, but it's important to stress that this is a time also when people are going to assume, in some cases, that maybe we got these roles because of our color and our gender. That can't be further from the truth. We've worked incredibly hard throughout our careers to earn these opportunities. We've earned them during some of the darkest, most challenging times in the industry. So I just want to ask you, do you agree? And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. I'll tell a personal story to start that off. So when I got this role, they were going through the process of making the announcement, right? What does the press release look like? What does it say? And they sent it to me, and the headline was, Miami Herald names its first African-American editor in the paper's 117-year history. And I started calling my journalist friends, and my girlfriends, and my mentors, and said, I don't know how I feel about that. Like, I'm not just Black. I got some skills too, right? It's like, the headline's like, and so I really had to, I literally like took the release and shared it with people and started rewriting it. I was just like kind of moving up my experience into the lead, right? I was just like, you know. And so when I had the conversation with the leaders who were making that decision, they said, you know, this is a big deal, right? And I said, well, of course, but I just don't want to be seen as just, getting the job because I'm black. I don't want that to be the headline. But it ended up being the headline. But it took one of my mentors to just remind me that it was what it was going to mean to the community here, because it was something they hadn't experienced, and for them, I was going to, and for a lot of communities, not just for the Black community, but for diverse communities, I was a representation that they hadn't seen or experienced before. And he kind of encouraged me. Reginald Stewart is his name, some of you may know him. He's a longtime executive, a former night writer, but he encouraged me to embrace the moment. And so I looked at it from a different perspective, right? And I'm glad that I did, because once I got here, I realized that people felt like they had a connection. They could reach out to me and tell me their stories in ways that they hadn't done with the previous senator. And the previous senator I've known for 20 years. But I would agree with that comment, because I've got 30 years of experience in the industry. And so to say that it's because of racial reckoning and what has happened in the country, it is, right? All of that is at play. And there's a part of me that believes we should be further along than that. But over and over again, we keep experiencing these first this, first that, right? That are warranted, but they're warranted not just because of the diversity aspect, but because of the experience as well. So I definitely would agree with that comment for sure. And I think that just means that there's still more work to be done. I won't put this organization on the spot, but look at the room, right? There's still more work to be done. I think we can all agree with that.
You've been very transparent and open about who you are and what you think. And over the summer, you drew attention when you wrote a column that it included, you addressed the comments from a reader who basically sent you a racist diatribe and called you racist names. And you wrote like a letter, open letter in the paper to the reader and to the other readers.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about, and I'm not going to quote from the letter that the reader sent you, but I wonder if you could sort of talk about that moment and why you decided to go public with your response to the reader.
For sure. So I'll give a little bit of context. The reader was responding to our coverage of the Cuban protests. And there was a law, a riot law, that, after George Floyd, it said that you couldn't gather a number of people, on a public street. And so after the protests, the Cuban community took to the streets, right? It was an important issue to that community. And so our reporters had been writing about it. And the letter came, I counted the number of words, right? I actually led with the number of words that it was. It was unlike, we're all journalists and we get hate mail all the time, right? It just happens. We get these letters and we read them, and sometimes they touch us, sometimes they make us angry, sometimes they make us want to do a story, take it further. This one was particularly hateful. It wasn't just it wasn't just a bad letter. It wasn't just another one of those letters that you get as an executive editor or as a journalist. It was really, really hateful. Like, you read it and you're like, oh. You read it again, like, wow. Like, that's just, you got that much hate in your heart. It just was, it was shocking to the point that I immediately felt the urge to respond, because I felt like often we get these letters, or we come across people who now vocally, right? People aren't shy about it anymore. They have permission. They think they have permission these days. And I felt like the only way for people to get past the moment is to expose it. Like, no, it's not okay. It's not okay to just decide you're gonna send me a letter and end it by calling me a racist email that ends by calling me a black racist bee. Like, the letter was full of that language. And I thought, you just wrote me a racist letter and then you called me racist. There's something wrong with that. And that's not okay. So I decided to write about that. And it was because I wanted to use my voice. I wanted to encourage other people to use their voices. And that was what I did in the column. I didn't intend to attack the writer. I didn't go after the person who wrote it. I didn't include his name. We kind of went through this process. Do we include the name? Do I reach out to him? Do I reply? Do I get a comment? But it was just a moment to say, this is the conversation that is happening in somebody's kitchen table. This is a conversation that is happening over Thanksgiving dinner somewhere. This man's son might be going to school with my 9-year-old. That's not okay. And so I used the column as an opportunity to empower people. Really, that's what I wanted to do, to empower people to be okay with saying, it's not okay. It's not okay to write that. It's not okay to say that. It's not okay to do that. And I heard from probably thousands easily of people who agreed and were shocked. This is the thing that made me realize it was worth the effort. So many people said, I can't believe they said that. Well, believe it. Believe it. These are some of our neighbors. Now, the other thing I said in the column was, he's completely entitled to his opinion. But hear mine too. And mine is reflective of a different perspective.
Right.
He had his perspective on our coverage. He had his perspective. And the other thing he did in it, he kept referring to your people this and your people that. And so I thought it was a moment for me to speak on behalf of communities that I consider my people. That includes the African American community. So it had an impact, and I felt like it was a moment that, people said I was brave for doing it. I didn't consider it brave until after it was done, and somebody was like, do you live in a secure community? And I was like, well, is it that bad? But anyway, it had an impact, and as journalists, that's what we do, right? We want to have an impact with the work that we do, and so that was me using my voice in a way to have an impact and empower people.
I actually want to read part of what you wrote. I was raised humble, raised to turn the other cheek and be the bigger person, to move on and get over it. That's a smart lesson and a smart way to move through life at times. This isn't one of those times. As a Black woman, I refuse to oblige the various ways that some people seem to demand that I simply take what they give. To the contrary, hate can't be solved with silence. The reality is that silence is as loud as the injustice of racism itself.
That's what I felt. Yeah. That I would be doing a disservice if I didn't say something. I needed to speak up for my staff. I needed to speak up for the communities who felt a different way. I think we all have that opportunity in the work that we do.
Yeah. It's a blessing to have that opportunity.
Yes.
To have the platform. Obviously, diversity, equity, and inclusion have really become big in newsrooms across the country. And I'm wondering if you could talk to me about what success in terms of DEI looks like in the newsroom of the future. And I don't, I'm not putting the Miami Herald on the spot, but I'm just talking about in general. What does success look like, and how do you get there?
Yeah, so, you all know this is something we've been talking about for years in newsrooms. And to me, it's about hiring, it's about promoting, it's about making sure that we have newsrooms. It's easy to say, and I know some news organizations have put percentages on it, right? X percentage of our newsrooms is going to reflect the communities that we serve. That's easier said than done. And so I believe that what we have to do is make sure that we think about it from all spectrums, like what does it look like in the room? And it's not black and white. There are a lot of ideas and perspectives, and I am African American, I'm a woman, I'm a single mother. All of that I bring my whole self, right? And so when we think about diversity and equity and inclusion in our rooms, that has to consider the coverage. We got to think about it in terms of the coverage. Just because it's the story of the Haitian community doesn't mean that a black reporter has to cover it. Just because it's the story of the Cuban community doesn't mean that a Cuban reporter has to cover it. But if you don't have those people and those voices in the room to build relationships, it makes sometimes, those beats harder to do. So I need to have someone in the room who understands the perspective of what a Cuban American feels participating in the protests, right? I need to have that perspective in my room, and I need to have the perspective of an African American man who my reporter can walk down the street and end up George Floyd, right? I need to have that perspective. I need people to understand that when I drive down the street, just the other day my daughter saw, we stopped at a stoplight, and my daughter saw a police officer stop an African American male, and she said, and just think about this in the mind of a 9-year-old. What's that white man doing? What's he gonna do to him? And I said, baby, that's a police officer, he just stopped somebody, right? But think about that in terms of the perspective, right? And so we have to get to a place where we have perspectives, different experiences in our room. And that doesn't come through checking off a DEI box. I think a lot of companies have fallen into this trap now of saying, oh, it's important now. It's always been important. It always will be important. So success to me looks like you have in everything from the way you cover a story, from looking at your sources. Who are your sources on your stories? Do they look different? The hiring I talked about, the promoting we talked about, it's not one thing. It's a whole lot of things that you have to do in your room to get to a place of success. But it's also realizing that it never stops. You don't get to a point and say, oh, we did it. Got our numbers, we did it. We are reflective of the communities that we serve. There's no stopping point to this. Mm-hmm. There's no end point. It continues. Mm-hmm. That work has to continue. Mm-hmm. So to me, the answer to what does success look like means it never stops.
Mm-hmm. But there must be some ways that you can maybe gauge, how you're doing along the way.
Oh, for sure. So one of the things we do in our newsroom, we have every couple of months or so, we do these community listening sessions. And we bring in diverse sources of our reporters, people in the community, not necessarily the talking heads, if you will, but people who are really rooted in their communities, and they talk to us about what we're missing. And so there are things like that you have to do to make sure. McClatchy actually at one point did an audit of its content to see who were the people we're talking to, and in some cases we're talking to the same people all the time. And so I think there are things that have to be done to say how can we get better. Sometimes that's going out and talking to the people you're covering, and sometimes that is looking at the coverage. And in the hiring, that means looking for people who can bring experiences who might not have the complete resume. The resume might not have everything you would want from a journalist, but they're a solid reporter, a solid leader, and they can do great work in the room. People can be trained on things they don't have. So those are some of the things you can do, and there are any number of those, but it is being really, and having thoughtful people in the room who speak up and say, this is what I think we should do. This is how we can reach someone. And not just, like I said, look at it as a checking off the box.
Right. In our conversation, before we came out, we had also talked about retention and how retention is really a big problem, not only at places that you've worked, but places I've worked, and newsrooms across America. It's really hard to retain people of color. And what are some of your thoughts about that? But before you answer the question, I wanted to just also bring up something that you said in the interview that was really, really interesting. We all know that, not just for people of color, but for everybody, newsrooms can sometimes be very unpleasant places, And I think you talked about when you were early in your career, and I think you were quoted in Pointer magazine, or their online publication, about an experience you had early in your career when you were a reporter, and you dreamed about being a copy editor, and you approached your editors and said, hey, I think I'd like to try copy editing. And this is kind of what you said. And they said to me, we're not ready for you to do that yet. I remember thinking, it's not what you're ready for me to do, it's what I'm ready for me to do. And I had this moment of realization that my career belonged to me.
Yeah.
So can you just talk about how you were able to turn things around from there?
Yeah, so I was that reporter who wanted to try other things in the room. And actually, that is what I think, what I bring with me to the role I'm in currently, actually. So I wanted to, the copy editor is really interesting, right? Can I test that out? Like, I wanted to just experience different roles and roles in the newsroom. I won't disclose what newspaper I was at. And so I just said, hey, I was asking for like a week. Like, can I spend a week or a few days and kind of, shadow and sit in? And I wasn't really asking to be an editor. I was just asking to get some experience doing something different. I was an education reporter at the time. And yeah, so I remember I could actually, how you have those moments you can see yourself somewhere? I could see myself in his office and him telling me, we're not ready for you to do that yet. And I made up my mind that day, I'm not going to be here in 6 months. And I wasn't. And I said those words, it's not about what you're ready for me to do. And I'm a bit of a unicorn. I've known I wanted to do this since I was in middle school. I started my first newspaper in middle school, so this is what I've always wanted to do. And somebody was saying, you can't do that? That's the reason I started my middle school newspaper, because somebody said you can't do that. So
that's a challenge here.
I know, right? So that moment, and a lot of other moments like that, where someone said, no, you can't, and I knew, well, let me try it, right? Sometimes we put our own limitations on ourselves, and this was somebody else putting that limitation on me. So I've never been a person to follow the status quo. I don't think as journalists we should be. And so I didn't follow the status quo. I knew I had a bigger dream, a bigger mission. I had, one of the reasons I decided to come here, I wasn't looking for a job when I got here. But one of the reasons I decided to come was I felt like I could make a difference. And so that moment was me, again, feeling like I had a place, an opportunity to make a difference doing something else.
Now that you're on the other side of the desk, what are you doing differently to ensure that people on your staff have an opportunity to try out new things and to be able to advance in their careers?
Yeah, we're constantly talking about, with my leaders, about how we can make sure first that our coverage is reflecting the communities that we serve. You know, for Miami, local, our focus is local. And local is Haiti, local is Cuba, local is Venezuela, local is Puerto Rico. Local is not just central Miami, right? It's not just downtown Miami. And so we have a responsibility, we talk about the responsibility that we have to make sure we are thinking about how people see themselves show up or not. How women show up in our coverage. From the, you know, from videos to photography to the headlines even, we talk about that. You know, when the Haitian community was at the border, we had this conversation on our news meeting about, that looks like slavery. Mm-hmm. That reminded me of slavery. And so we have the conversation all the time. We make it a huge part of our mission. I know we're on time. Huge part of our mission when we are looking for diversity to bring into our room, and we don't make any excuses about it, from the coverage to internally and externally as well.
Mm-hmm. So we'll open it up to the audience out there. Any questions?
First, thank you for inspiring us today.
Thank you.
Second, I'm wondering, just from a quantitative point of view, if you're seeing any traffic or circulation increase from Newsroom DEI efforts.
That's that's one of your questions, right? The business of it. It's hard to measure that really, but I can tell you that I sense it when I go out. I was recently, I went to the wake for Congresswoman Carrie Meek, who just passed. Her funeral was this week. And when I go into the community now, people say, that was a great story on. So anecdotally, I know that we are reaching more people, not to discredit work that's been done in previous years. It's not just me, right? It's not because I'm here. But people do, and our staff does feel more empowered, I think. The measurements are a good thing to figure out what do we do to measure it. Those community listening sessions that I talked about are one of the ways that we do it here. But I think it's hard to measure because you don't ask, right? When we can look at the demographics of our readers and hope that changes. And I think over time we might see that difference. So that's one place we can look to as we look to the metrics. But there is a business case for it. If I don't see myself in your product, whatever your product might be, why would I pick it up? Why would I go to it? I don't see myself there. I don't see my community there. So that's the audience growth piece of it. That's the opportunity that we have.
Doing well by doing good.
Doing well by doing good.
Yes, exactly. Doing well by doing good. Exactly.
Just one more question, and a quick question, because we were actually over.
Oh, okay. How do you manage in a day when people aren't coming into the office and everybody's like dispersed? How do you get the culture to change in a newsroom when everybody's working remotely?
Yeah, that's really tough. Newsroom culture is a beast anyway when we are in a building. So I have now, it'll be a year that I would not have been in a newsroom. It's the weirdest feeling ever for a newsroom, for a journalist. And I was telling you earlier, some of my reporters can walk by me and I might not recognize them because I don't know that I'm still learning them, I'm still building the culture. My editors are meeting this week, tomorrow actually, for a retreat. And one of the big things I have on that list is newsroom culture. What do we look like now? What do we want to be? What do we want to look like? And so we'll talk about that and put some framework around, are we, everything from I know this was on your list too as well, Dion, everything from the mental health of our staff and the importance of that to connections. I have regular team meetings. We have, you know, regular newsroom stand-up every week, and I'm always impressed that there are like 80 people on the call. But it's also a sign that people want to be connected. Our journalists in the room have started to, on their own, get together in small groups and work from each other's homes. We actually don't have a building right now with Miami Herald, and so we're, you know, hoping to be back and possibly find a building and then figure out if we can get into a building early next year, possibly. But that's a tough one. That culture, newsroom culture is already tough, and so you add in a pandemic, it's even tougher. But it makes communication even more important. Like over-communicating is super important. You can't just send a text message. You gotta pick up the phone now, right? It's little things like that, I think, that help make the difference. It's also having a conversation in the room and saying, what is it that we need to change in the culture? What needs to happen? And if you don't give room for those conversations, then nothing will change. So to me, that's the biggest thing, is realizing that you gotta communicate, you gotta over-communicate right now. And then two, you gotta be open to letting people talk about it. What do they need? What do people need? And it surprises you some of the answers you get. I really see that as, that's not just a leadership role, that's everybody has a responsibility and a voice in that conversation.
Well, thank you so much for your
Thank
time.
you.